Welcome back. Our next speaker is Alan Hansen. Alan is an independent researcher. He was born and raised in northern Israel. He served a mission in Russia, and he married Katrina from Ukraine. They are parents to a daughter. His research interests include the Bible, ancient, medieval, and early modern Jewish literature, Book of Mormon translation, and the meeting points between the Church, Judaism, and the history of Israel. So at this time, we'd like to turn the time over to Alan.
Thank you, Scott. All right, today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the Kabbalah and how it connects to church history or doesn't. So the Kabbalah is an attractive naturalistic explanation for the revelations and teachings of Joseph Smith. This is a Jewish mystical tradition with vast and enormous literature containing themes that on the surface resemble LDS teachings. The claim, however, suffers from methodological problems. Samuel Brown summed up the fundamental issue when he said that Owen's article isn't grounded in expected rules of evidence or interpretation. It would be absurd to deny environmental influence on the early church. The Restoration did not occur in a vacuum. Far from it. Early church members came from certain religious and intellectual contexts that obviously informed their new religious outlook. The problem is when historians get caught up in what Mark Bloch called the idol of origins. That is to confuse the historic moment for a sufficient explanation of a religion's causes, and it is almost invariably in the service of the mania for making judgments. If there were direct links to Kabbalah, that would not invalidate Joseph's prophetic calling. Yet claims of such links tend to be a way of undermining the historic claims associated with that calling. Now, as a believer talking to other believers, I would call this individual innovation divine revelation. Joseph was a religious genius, and God used it for his purposes. The claimed connection to Kabbalah is untenable. We shall see why. All right, the Kabbalah is the study of the hidden realms of the life of the Godhead and man's relationship to it. The Kabbalah is the dominant form of Jewish mysticism or esotericism. It is a legitimate, venerable part of Orthodox Judaism that has inspired many of its traditions and liturgy. Judaism has always had an esoteric core, tending to center in these things: the creation and Garden of Eden, the temple earthly and heavenly, the name of God, his throne, the power of Hebrew letters, and the angels. The Kabbalah is a medieval development of these earlier esoteric traditions, evolving into a complex system of symbols and correspondences of the emanated forms of the Godhead. This image is a little bit messed up with the graphic, but this is going to explain visually what I'm going to talk about right now. So this is the most distinctive feature of Kabbalah. It depicts the Godhead as consisting of various emanations. Sephirot from Ein Sof, essentially the first cause. The Sephirot are God's active power and attributes. They emanate from within him and take on a different shape or attribute at each level. Though they flow out from God, they remain hidden deep inside and are the unity of God, not entities separate from him. They're how he reveals himself in the world. So they have many different names and functions and terms, and they share each other's unity, so while they're many, they're also considered one. And they're constantly reconfiguring. Often, these configurations are seen as mirroring the human body or the marital dynamics of husband and wife. Other concepts include the portrayal of God in religious obligations in sexual terms, symbolic correspondences, the power of Hebrew letters, transmigration of souls, and a unique concept of evil. The Zohar is an important book that makes part of the claims, it's connected to the claims of the critics. So we need to spend a minute talking about it. It appeared in Spain towards the end of the 13th century, the pinnacle of its Kabbalistic creativity. It is a book of mystery. It plays with language, it tells stories often contradictory, It offers a glimpse of the hidden realities and structures of the world, lurking behind seemingly ordinary things such as the petals of a rose, a sunrise, or an apple orchard. As Rashbi, the Talmudic sage, and his companions journey from place to place and discourse with each other, they uncover the secrets of the Torah. The Zohar is a love-struck book full not only of man's longing for the divine, but of God's love for man. Now, the Kabbalah saw many ups and downs. The 18th century was the peak of a Kabbalah's influence, but the beginning of the 19th century saw the Kabbalah in retreat. There were many political and sociological changes, and few groups emphasized popular study of the Kabbalah. Now, when it comes to the history of the United States, the Kabbalah did play an influential, though largely unnoticed, role in early American religious thought. Men from backgrounds as different as the Quaker schismatic George Keith, the Puritan Mather family, and the Congregational minister Ezra Stiles all engage in some form as part of their Christian beliefs. Judah Monis was an Italian Jew with a solid rabbinical education who converted to Christianity in 1722 under the personal guidance of Increase Mather. Monis had with him a handwritten manuscript of various Lurianic texts that was donated to Harvard after his death. This was unique in the Americas, but does not seem to have been consulted much at all, even by academics today. Whatever the reason, Monis himself does not appear to have used the manuscript in his discourse to lay out his Christian Kabbalistic beliefs, which is entitled Nothing But the Truth. Monis's writings exerted a tremendous influence on the young Ezra Stiles, whom he also met, leading him towards a lifelong fascination with the Kabbalah. In his early years, Stiles wrote on the plurality of Elohim, finding support for it in the Zohar, mediated via secondary sources. However, we should not be misled by LDS understandings of the term. Stiles was writing about the Trinity. Whereas the Old Testament clearly taught a plurality of gods but not a Trinity explicitly, the Zohar held the right interpretive key to prove the Trinity. After acquiring the Zohar and reading what he could of it for himself, Stiles tried to meet with any rabbinic emissary visiting the colonies. He was able to study Kabbalah and the Zohar with at least two of them. Stiles was not a representative man. He was unique in his generation in his deep knowledge of and appreciation for the Kabbalah, directly from primary sources. I was only able to locate one explicitly Kabbalistic work written and printed in the Americas before the 1860s, 1870s, and that was Monis's. The writings of the Mathers and Stiles seem to be the only other reflections of Kabbalistic teachings in American religious thought. The small American Jewish community at the time was not noted in the Jewish world for its deep learning and scholarship. There would not even be an ordained rabbi residing there until 1840. Certainly, the occasional Kabbalists did visit to raise funds for their communities, and some of them traveled with their personal copies of the Zohar. That does not indicate that American Jews themselves had much understanding or appreciation of the Kabbalah. Gershom Mendes Seixas was poorly educated and was never ordained a rabbi. He was a chazan, the communal officiary that dealt with practical matters of worship. On occasion, he'd also deliver sermons and addresses. Seixas' printed sermons show he eagerly anticipated the coming arrival of the Messiah in light of the Napoleonic Wars, but do not betray any pronounced influence of the Kabbalah. This is one area in which you might expect to see the most influence. The lack of such is telling. Okay, now Hannah Adams was a remarkable woman by any standard. She grew up in genteel poverty, suffering from ill health her entire life. She was intelligent, educated, and intellectually curious. She largely relied on the library of Unitarian Reverend Friend to compile her 1812 History of the Jews. She was also granted access to the library of the Boston Athenaeum without paying a subscription fee. Nearly all her knowledge of the Kabbalah comes from a single book. Her history extracts a quote about 3 pages in length. That was the extent of what her readers might take away from it. Without a network of friends and benefactors among New England and Boston Brahmin society, Adams could not have written her book. There may have only been a single copy of the Zohar in North America during the 1820s-40s. Stiles acquired one from London after several years of trying. It was expensive. This copy of the Zohar cost Stiles as much as someone's entire financial worth. It was not a negligible sum. I could not locate another Zohar in the library prior to the 20th century. Contemporary libraries' catalogs do not show the Zohar. While there may be gaps, the picture is representative. Only one library had any Kabbalistic books at all. Private collectors may have had some other books, but even those at the universities, whether student or faculty, they did not necessarily have easy access to books unless they knew someone with a copy. By my estimates, other than monists, there may not have been more than 10 physical copies of Kabbalistic books in America until 1844 at least. So it was not impossible to learn something of the Kabbalah and Jacksonian America, but would have likely required seeking it out specially and having the right connections, rather than coming across the information casually. Freemasonry, though, provided an indirect source of influence. This fraternal order was something of American obsession in the nation's early years. Masonry was seen as breaking down class barriers and teaching the virtues needed in the new republic. Christian Kabbalah was the ultimate intellectual source of much of earliest Masonry, especially its fascination with names, coded Christology, and Hebrew letters. Okay. Instead of looking at whatever might have been published anywhere in the Anglophone world, and assuming Joseph had access or the ideas were in the air, we must start with what we can know about what he read and when. Documents which list books that either Joseph or the church had in their possession would provide a reasonable assumption. In 1836, the church purchased books to be sold in Kirtland. Among them were 4 sets of this 13-volume Encyclopedia Americana. The entry on Kabbalah is very brief, about half a page in length. Sidney Rigdon donated Henry Hart Millman's 3-volume History of the Jews in 1844 to the Nauvoo Library, which contains a single brief negative mention of the Kabbalah in a footnote. We do not know when Rigdon acquired the book. A different excerpt from it, though, was published in the Times and Seasons in 1841. Now, the situation isn't much different when they actually encounter Jews. When Oliver Cowdery met with an old Jew in New York in the autumn of 1835, they had a conversation on whether the Messiah had already been on earth. There is nothing even faintly reminiscent of the Kabbalah in Cowdery's account of the conversation. In 1835, the church famously decided to engage a Hebrew teacher for the elders. They briefly hired Daniel Peixoto before settling on Joshua Seixas, Gershom's son. Seixas undoubtedly learned some Hebrew at home. However, most of his knowledge came academically from scholars in the United States, relying on the work of German Christian Hebraists such as Gesenius. He discreetly converted to Unitarianism at some point in the late 1820s to 1830s, which was an easier path to Christianity than Trinitarianism, as it did not involve a belief in the plurality of gods. So already he's very much predisposed against the ideas that should have influenced Joseph Smith. A Times and Seasons entry does mention the Zohar, but it's a reprint of a dialogue from London missionary paper. The editorial commentary only remarks on how both the Jew and the Christian are ignorant of the truth, yet the arrogant Christian is the one acting presumptuously. There is simply no interest expressed in the content of Jewish ideas. Okay. With the Smith family, only one Kabbalistic practice can be indisputably tied to them. That's the faculty of Abarak. This had a specific fixed meaning at the time and referred to a central Masonic mystery which combined the letters of a divine name in order to access its power. It could be used both for healing, for gaining material objects and wealth, and for increasing spiritual knowledge. A critic of Masonry sneered at the Masonic legend of the Grand Master Hiram Abiff, who could not save himself from murder by using this magic. The highest form of this faculty in Masonry focused on gaining a true understanding of the name of God. That practice came to the Smith family indirectly through Masonry, with no indication of any awareness of historical Kabbalistic connections. In the Kabbalah, there's a practice called Yihudim, which combine the divine names also to access their power and knowledge and bring about desired results in the heavens and elevate the soul. Most Masons themselves were likely unaware of the connection. And while it is true that the Kabbalah uses highly anthropomorphic imagery and language for God, so does the Bible. That is the ultimate source of such imagery in Kabbalah. Joseph encountered the Bible long before he did the Kabbalah, if at all. So any broad conceptual similarity cannot serve as evidence of his familiarity with the Kabbalah. So as we have seen, the likelihood of Joseph being acquainted with the Kabbalah in the 1820s and 30s is infinitely small. Owens, though, pointed to what seems a likely conduit in the 1840s, Alexander Neibaur. Neibaur was a Jewish convert to Christianity who moved to Preston, England. We had a vision of the Book of Mormon and joined the church. The Smoking Gun is an article he penned for the Times and Seasons, which quotes some Kabbalistic books, including the Zohar. This might seem odd when we have a text Neibaur wrote citing Kabbalistic works, but the question must be asked, could Neibaur have known Kabbalah? The answer in theory is yes. Even in an era of Enlightenment or Haskalah, both Jewish tradition and the influence of German Romanticism were strong enough to temper more radical expressions of Enlightenment thought and make room for Kabbalah in some role among Germanified Jews. The historical picture, though, is a little more complicated. The 1756 restriction on the study of Kabbalah before attaining the age of 40 was rarely strictly enforced among the rabbinical elite. Works like the Zohar could be studied from age 30, even under the restriction. Indeed, there was no enforcement mechanism, no Zohar police. The restriction formalized the limits of the permissible in studying Kabbalah under a rabbinic framework, which led to a more selective attitude by Kabbalists towards students. And despite the fact that certain German Jews had a positive view of the Zohar, overall it was regarded with embarrassment and derision. Alexander Neibaur grew up in Unruhstadt, Kargowa, marked in yellow on the map. It's a Polish town that had become a part of Prussian Poland. Culturally, it was somewhat unusual in the German states. There was a modernizing German-Jewish element informed by the Enlightenment, mostly among the new elites. But the larger, Yiddish-speaking traditional Polish Jewish society, the Ostjuden, was dominant until the 1840s. The Prussian authorities, unprepared for a massive influx of Ostjuden since the partition of Poland, implemented harsh, restrictive policies against the Jews of the Duchy. Neibaur's family background also provides some clues. His father, himself a dentist, had a Western education and spoke French and German. Generally at that time, a medical education also involved embracing some kind of at least moderate Enlightenment values. If his father's profession was not indicator enough, we know that Neibaur himself grew up speaking German, which again indicates his family belonged to the wealthier segments of society. The very fact that he could leave to study dentistry in Berlin at a time when the authorities severely restricted Jews from traveling beyond the limits of the duchy suggests that his family had enough means and influence to circumvent that restriction. Eastern Prussian Jews and non-Jews left the region in droves as soon as they had the means to do so. Most left for America, many for Berlin. Neibaur found himself in England. As a teenager, he studied to be a rabbi in accordance with his father's wishes. There is no record of where he studied, but we can make an educated guess. The old-fashioned yeshiva was in steep decline in Eastern and Central Europe. Hardly anyone attended them by the 1810s, yet the few which existed were still prestigious, and attending one meant that you were integrated into a whole social network of elite rabbinic connections. Nearby Posen was home to the largest and most prestigious of these yeshivot. So had Neibaur attended one, he would likely have mentioned it, and leaving early could have caused a rift with his family. So instead of the yeshiva, what typically happened is that from age 4 to 6, boys began studying under a tutor, the melamed, and a chedel. The goal was for the boys to learn the letters and then learn how to study a Talmudic tractate on their own by age 13. The Talmud is notoriously labyrinthine and difficult, even for adults. At the age of 13, if a boy had any aptitude, he would enter a Beit Midrash in a neighboring community, not his own. This was a communal study space where groups of people would study the Talmud off and on. Unmarried youth would spend most of the week in the Beit Midrash, sleeping on benches there. They were expected to study the Talmud independently. There were no formal teachers and only occasional adult instruction. The purpose of all this was to help them study the Talmud on their own. Not the Kabbalah, even though some might have had Kabbalistic books, but not all B'tei Midrash even had a complete set of Talmudic tractates. Even if we assume access, that does not translate to Kabbalah being a focus for younger students. For meals, they relied on members of the community to feed them. Hopefully, this led to the student marrying into the community. There was a catch that served to filter out the unwilling and inept. Support depended on how well they studied and how promising a scholar they were. If you were a poor student or you goofed off, you would starve most days. The well-off got a prestigious Torah scholar for a son-in-law, and it forced the students to show they could sacrifice for the sake of Torah, one of the great values in the Jewish community. So this was very public. Everyone saw how seriously the youth studied and how well he could answer Talmudic questions. It really was not possible to fake it till you make it or pretend to be proficient. Once the student proved himself and got married, he continued studying until he qualified for a communal post. That was a career path. A lot of youth either never tried or abandoned the Beit Midrash at some point. Neibaur says that by age 17, he knew becoming a rabbi wasn't for him. This matches the Beit Midrash setting, as does his independence to decide his own path, the vague details on his schooling, and why his choice to leave did not trigger a break with his family. This is about as near as we can find out, considering that Beit Midrash left no records, and Neibaur never mentioned where he studied either. So, in summary, it's highly unlikely that Neibaur did study Kabbalah or have more than a passing familiarity with it. And that's a point that Owens later largely conceded. Okay. Neibaur published an article in the Times and Seasons on Jewish beliefs of the resurrection. According to Owens, what he, Neibaur, discusses for the most part is, however, the Kabbalistic concept of Gilgul, transmigration and rebirths of souls. Some of the works mentioned are definitely Kabbalistic. The number of quotations in the piece is remarkable, which leads Owens to speculate that Neibaur possessed a sizable Kabbalistic library, or at least some books. No trace of any Hebrew book belonging to Neibaur has been found or listed as part of his estate upon his death. And this, for example, is Emek HaMelech, one of the books that Neibaur mentioned, and this is about the size that they would have been printed in. In 19th century American frontier, this was not something you'd be carting around lightly or just misplace. The problem with assuming that Neibaur had a strong familiarity with the Kabbalah is that not only are many of the quoted works not Kabbalistic, the quotes from these Kabbalistic works are not esoteric. The Zohar and other books contain revealed or exoteric content, alongside the concealed or esoteric layers, and such material was widely excerpted and anthologized. It cannot be assumed from these brief references that Neibaur knew or understood the syphilitic structure, which is at the heart of Kabbalah. And the Gilgul in the article is not the transmigration of souls. Rather, it's the Gilgul Mechilot, an arduous ordeal that those buried outside the land of Israel will undergo before resurrection. That's to take place in Israel, so to get there, the earthly remains of the righteous will be rolled and tumbled through tunnels. Neibaur was referencing the discussion of it in the Talmud. Some Kabbalists connected this to transmigration, but their work is not mentioned by Neibaur, nor does it match the context he's discussing. What's more, we don't see any mention of widely studied, exclusively Kabbalistic works that contain important statements on the Kabbalah and resurrection. Why not use them if you were aware of them? And why skip the most distinctive and interesting content in these books on resurrection and just go for the boring, bland ones if he had access to them? I've yet to identify what book or maybe a couple of books he used, but it was probably an anthology of some sorts. So there's no guarantee that he had access to the rest of the Zohar. The King Follett sermon was delivered by Joseph Smith in April 1844 to comfort mourners. The sermon's main theme was the nature of God and how that relates to man's eternity and potential. This sermon stands as one of the finest and grandest of the Restoration. Owens wrote that Joseph apparently quotes almost word for word from the first section of the Zohar. A strong claim. Does it hold up? The Zohar imagery is weird and wonderful. This passage is about the process in the divine itself, leading to the emergence of the sephirotic structure of the Godhead. The creation of the Godhead, which though not ex nihilo, occurs in a very different sense to Joseph's usage of bara as convening an assembly. This creation starts out with the authority or potency of the king Ein Sof, whose essence is nothing. It is the first cause, the unmoved mover, of which nothing can be said except by negation. We can only say what he's not. And the language in this passage serves to distance him even from this act. He carves faint engravings in the brilliant light surrounding him, which is keter. These engravings will later become the other sfirot. Right now they exist only in potential. And one 18th century commentary visualized this as an architectural blueprint setting out the dimensions and locations of future buildings. This happens long before the process of emanation proper, long before the creation of the world. A spark, botzina di cardinuta, appears, but it is itself a spark or lamp of darkness. It's so concealed its light doesn't shine, and paradoxically it's so bright that it would blind you if you could see it, which means that it's basically a dark color even though it's light. The spark proceeds from Ein Sof, essentially formless like a vapor of mist, enclosed in the seal ring of purity. And it's so tight that nothing can get in, and nothing's differentiated, not even colors. That spark is the instrument by which the sfirot are formed. And the Zohar myths use a bewildering array of symbols, especially in this passage. Now, the emanation breaks forth as a single concentrated point. The sephirah is chokhmah, wisdom, and is termed reishit, beginning. The first sephirah of which we can truly know anything at all. Not rosh, head, but reishit. This corresponds to Psalms 111:10, which contains the phrase reishit chokhmah, that was read to mean beginning is wisdom. Now, there's a lot of sexual imagery throughout this. It alludes to the process of emanation and birth and creation. Reshit expands from a single point and builds itself a magnificent palace. This palace is an ex-sphera Binah, intelligence or understanding. Chokhmah and Binah are a pair that represent the divine father and mother respectively, or the seed and womb, because they conceive and birth the rest of the sphirot. Dwelling in this palace, Reshit, the seed, enters Binah, the womb, the seed leading to the creation of the Shekhinah, symbol of God's consort, and the holy assembly of Israel. This begetting seed benefits the entire world. The process of emanation continues, the seed being likened to a silkworm who weaves its magnificent clothing and palace out of its own substance. Binah, this palace, is given the divine name Elohim. That is what the Zohar means when it says, with beginning, created God. That is the hidden Ein Sof by means of the Sphira Chokhmah, in its configuration of Reshit, created Elohim, which is the Sphira Binah. Beit functions as an instrumental preposition and is essential to the meaning of the entire construct. It cannot be discarded without completely altering the meaning. This is a very different concept to Joseph's, though both use an eccentric interpretation of the text and both turn God into the object of the sentence. Joseph drops beit and the suffix it, leaving him with Rosh, the head of the gods. The head creates the other gods and forms a divine council of gods who are all separate beings. The beit and the it, on the other hand, are essential to the Zohar's concept of Ein Sof, using a sephira named Reshit, the beginning. In order to create a palace for his sephirot to bring forth others, all manifestations of himself, not actual separate human beings. Almost no imagery in this Zohar passage has any equivalent in the King Follett Discourse. So it's really unlikely that Joseph had access to this or was basing his ideas on it. Now, visually, this is something that is really important to note. Seixas's grammar has, in the beginning, he created God, if you read it like that. And Gibbs' lexicon talks about a person, an individual, a chief, a head, the first of its kind. So we have here the right order and the right content for Joseph's springboard. He doesn't need the Kabbalah for any of this. And in Doctrine and Covenants, section 76, Joseph and Sidney Rigdon had a vision of God on his throne. And that's the heavenly retinue surrounding his throne where he reigns over his creations. And the wording of the vision is that of the biblical divine council. Further imagery connects the vision to Amos 3 and what is revealed to God's servants, the prophets. Here, in Joseph's vision, by combining the language of Deuteronomy, the divine council can be open to human participation for more than just prophets. Even the deification of man is explicitly stated there. Those who dwell in God's presence inherit everything he have and become gods. The Book of Abraham also provides a picture of divine counsel looking back to the creation of the world. So we have everything that we need right there before the sermon. And the central logic of the sermon is so thoroughly Christological, takes the implication of the incarnation of Jesus to its radical extreme. So blasphemous as it may be to Orthodox Trinitarians, this doctrine is relatively easy to draw from the New Testament and rather more difficult to do so from the Zohar. Okay, so everything was there in place before. And we also know, I'm going to cut it short here, the rest is going to be in my paper, but we also know that names were so important to the sermon and it was connected to the early temple. And while the Kabbalah is fascinated with names, there's other sources for it too, including Joseph's revelations, including Freemasonry. So the claim that Joseph interacted with directly or was inspired in any meaningful way by the Kabbalah is untenable. No facet of early Mormon history or doctrine can be better explained by such a connection. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that presentation. That was really interesting. as I've mentioned to you before, this is not an area where I've really done a lot of research myself and such. And I also know that you were pressed for time and for the subject matter. So what direction should we take research for the future? What additional research do you think we ought to be doing in this area?
So one of the things that we really need to do, and I'm planning on working this myself, is identify which book Alexander Neibaur might have been quoting from. There's a couple of suggestions. Bill Hamlin's didn't quite pan out for all of it, but it's a source of significant portions. It was also written by one of the first people to propose connections between Native Americans and lost tribes and so on back in the 17th century. But the biggest things that we can do is explore some of the more ancient connections, as well as just some of the, it's completely escaped from my mind the word I used at the beginning, but basically just some of the parallels between some of the Kabbalists and Joseph's ideas so we can understand each better in its own sphere, not make a connection. It gives us a lot of comparative material. And the other fantastic thing about the Zohar and Kabbalistic writings is these were, even though they have radical thoughts, these are very conservative thinkers, and they preserve a lot of early material. And really interestingly, sometimes they're even clearer about the ancient connotations in some of the earlier works we have.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, because they look into it and they tease out these ideas that are there.
Uh-huh.
So you can oftentimes use it to kind of reverse engineer a lot of thinkings or use it as a control against things.
So you think this is a book we should be reading?
It's definitely a book that's worth reading. It's very, very deep and complex, but there's a lot that can be done with it. We just need to be more familiar with it and the research around it and not jump to very simplistic conclusions.
Well, I've always been impressed as I've read some literature from that culture and such, how scholarship was valued and how complex the writings tend to be sometimes. I mean, like, as you said, they don't go for the I don't know how to put this, the off-the-shelf fluff stuff. It's more it's a lot more. Let's think about this a little bit.
And let's think it to death.
That's a great way of putting it. Let's think it to death.
So there's a lot of things we can get from there. That's why I do encourage people to look more into this. I'm doing that myself also, but there is a lot of rich material that we can use to draw insights from, even if there's not a direct connection.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate your time. And again, you've opened my eyes to a new direction I hadn't thought of before, although, I recognize some of those things from history I've read and such, but I've just never gone in that direction, probably because it's out of my element in my experience base. And so I didn't have a firm foundation to move that direction, and knowing full well, I mean, I've been to some synagogues and and visited with some rabbis and things about things, and knew I was out of my depth sometimes with some of that. So I really appreciate your time on this.
Thank you, Scott. It was a pleasure.